No, my mic is not good, King.
Hello,
Why you scamming me?
everybody. Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. Today, me and Harry Storm are gonna mess around in a game called Evade. I think that's how we say it.
Evade. Evade.
Yes, Evade. So now I'm gonna join and we're gonna mess around, find out what happens next.
No, let me say it because I'm better at this, okay? Hand me down. Hand me down. So, guys, it's a special round. It's a slow round. So, I guess we have to figure out what happens next.
Well, bro, I want the skibidi toilet in this game. Oh, what
Okay, I'm gonna mess around this guy and I'm gonna figure out what happens next. I think I'm gonna figure out what happens next right now. Help! I'm gonna figure out what happens next!
Yeah!
Not kill Kiwis!
Bartichel!
Okay.
I survived!
We didn't figure out what happens
I
next.
survived! I survived! Yay! Crossroad.
No, Kiwis, listen. For this stream, we need to have like less energy, right? Just brain rot.
Oh. Yeah.
Right, and don't talk about your problems. No. We just talk about, figure out what happens next. That's the only thing you're allowed to say. Nothing else. Like, you can add something before that, that's the only thing you can say.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay.
Okay, and figure out what happens next.
Yeah. Mess around and find out find out what happens next. Yes.
Figure out what happens next.
Figure out what happens next. Mess around and figure out
You need
what
to
happens
get
next.
headsets.
Figure out what happens next.
Kiwis, your mic is trash.
Figure out what happens next.
Okay, this stream is not going as intended. I think it's better for me to solo stream it.
No. Let's go.
You can't say that. You can't say let's go. Because you forgot to figure out what happens next.
Figure out what happens next. Is that a generator? No. Figure out what happens next.
I guess we will have to go to that generator and figure out what happens next.
Is this a potty? Okay, we're gonna figure out what happens next then.
No, we have to go to it and we have to figure out what happens next. I guess we will go to it and figure out what happens next.
Survive for 3 minutes and figure out what happens next.
Exactly, you're getting it. W. Guys, W in the chat and figure out what happens next. I think he's figuring what happens next. Guys, literally Kiwis is figuring out what happens next. He's learning so fast and figuring out
electricity
what happens
and
next.
figure out what happens next.
Okay, let's mess around the NPC and figure out what happens next.
Is that lava? I'm gonna touch it and figure out what happens next.
Exactly, and figure out what happens next.
Is that a laser? And figure out what happens next.
Is that a green NPC? I guess I'm gonna stick around him. And what happens next? I'm gonna stick around that NPC and I'm gonna figure out what happens next.
Harry Storm, please save me and figure out what happens next. On your right,
Okay.
and figure out. And figure out what. Still. Figure out what
Somebody
happens
is
next.
kidnapping you. I guess you're gonna figure out what happens next. The kidnapper of yours kidnapped you and saved you. I guess he figured out what happens next.
And figure out what happens next. He wants me!
He wants to figure out what happens next after he
I didn't
revives
figure
you.
out. He's gonna figure out what happens next now. He's gonna figure it out.
Kiwis, you're putting too much emotion. You need to talk like you're gonna die and figure out what happens next. I'm behind you. I guess you figure out that by yourself. I'm dead. I guess I figured out what happens next.
Yeah.
This guy just figured out what happens next. Somebody is scaring me and I guess they're gonna figure out what happens next. They're reviving me because they want to see they want to figure out what happens next.
I'm running to figure out what happens next.
The NPC is chasing me. I guess I'm gonna figure out what happens next.
Did you figure out what happens next?
I am figuring out what happens next.
Okay, I already figured out what happens next.
This guy is messing around the NPC. I guess he's gonna figure out what happens next.
I'm gonna
This
go
guy's
get around the NPC
messing
and figure
around
out what happens
with the
next.
NPC.
For real, for
He's gonna
real.
figure out what
Let's
happens
figure out-
next.
He's gonna figure it out right now.
I am going around circles with the NPC. I guess I'm gonna figure out what happens next.
How are you not in school?
I figured out what happens next.
We figured out what happens next.
This map sucks. I guess I figured out that it happens next.
Mess around. Let's mess around the NPC and figure out what happens next time.
Let's figure out what happens next on this map. Okay, I'm gonna ban the word West and I'm gonna ban the word any words after I figure out what happens next. There should be nothing. And I'm also gonna ban emotion.
Figure out.
I am gonna find where the NPC is and I'm gonna figure out what happens next.
Figure out what happens next. NPC, I want to kill you and figure out what happens next.
Humus is gonna figure out what happens next.
I will figure out what's happening next. Look, I'm gonna figure out what happens next.
I figured out what happens next.
Bad
I think I'm gonna
emotion,
figure out what
bad
happens next.
emotion and
Fama
figure out-
also. I
Bad
am gonna
emo-
figure out what happens next.
Bad emotion and figure out what happens next. Why am I so slow? And figure out what happens next.
I still haven't figured out what happens next. I'm gonna stick around like a sore thumb and I'm gonna figure out what happens next.
I'm gonna run around and figure out what happens next.
I'm gonna chase you and I'm gonna figure out what happens next. I think we're gonna figure out what happens next. We're sticking around, messing around, so I guess we're gonna figure out what happens next.
I got away and figured out what happened next.
No, you can't say that. You didn't. Because I figured out on what happens next. Figure out what happens next. I am gonna find the NPC and I'm gonna figure out what happens next.
I found the NPC and I'm gonna figure out what happens next.
Exactly. And figure out what happens next. And figure out what happens next. Guys, like and subscribe and figure out what happens next.
I found the NPC is trying to kill me and I'm gonna find out what happens next.
Hey, that's not how you say it. You're gonna figure out what happens next. I see the NPC. I will figure out what happens next.
Yes, me too. And I'm gonna figure out what happens next.
I think I'm gonna figure out what happens next. in a
Yeah, I
second.
think you're gonna...
I still haven't figured out what happens next.
Neither have I. Figured out what happens next.
I'm gonna figure out what happens next.
I'm gonna figure out
Kiwis is
what
gonna
happens
figure
next.
out what happens next.
What do you mean? I don't see this. I don't know what happens next. Oh wait, I'm gonna know what happens next! Oh, never mind. Haha, easy. I didn't
I say
figure out
he-
what happens next. I'm first place
Sin,
and figured out
I
what
haven't
happens
figured
next.
out what happens next.
Who's first place? Haha. I
Let's
figured
mess
out what
around
hap-
him and let's mess around him and we're gonna figure out what happens next.
I figured out what happens next and became fifth.
No, you haven't. Because your brain, you should forget that what happened and you keep saying it like you have dementia.
I'm gonna figure out what happens next.
W. I said W. W and figure out what happens next. I see SpongeBob. I guess I'll figure out what happens next. SpongeBob is coming towards me. I guess I'm gonna figure out what happens next. I think Historian scored 5-6, messed around, and he figured out what happens next. Historian scored 5-6, he's messing around, and he's gonna figure out what happens again. What happens next again?
King of Ages figured out what happened next. King of Ages sees an NPC flying and is gonna
King
figure out what
messing
happens
around,
next.
and he's gonna figure out what happens next. King is gonna figure out what happens next. This guy is messing around the NPC, and he's gonna figure out what happens next. I am gonna figure out what happens next. You're gonna figure out what happens next.
Yeah, that's what I would have did. I said earlier.
I figured out what happens next. I'm gonna go to that tower with the weird sound effects, and I'm gonna figure out what happens next.
You're right, so that's the technique. If you're gonna, he's there. He's nothing he can do about it. He's not even looking. Give him a push, he's done.
I'm gonna figure out what happens next.
I'm gonna figure out what happened next.
This guy messed around, he figured out what happens next. I guess we didn't figure out what happens next.
And I wanted to know what was gonna happen next.
No, you have dementia. You're breaking character. What's gonna happen there? And what's... I'm gonna figure out what happens next.
I'm gonna figure out what happens next.
I'm gonna figure out what happens next. I'm gonna figure out what's going on there and figure out what happens next. You think that's gonna be a good stream if we play RTS game?
No.
I think it's gonna be actually good.
I have 5 minutes.
Okay. Все накупил. Давай. Okay, пока. Chark is gonna figure out what happens next by talking in Russian.
I am gonna figure out what happens next.
This is an F map. I guess I'll figure out what happens next.
Open door and figure out what happens next.
This girl runs around like a tomato lost in the forest. I guess she'll figure out what happens next.
No. Hi. ستة وخمسين.
I revive this person because I want to figure out what happens next.
شو اللي باب المفروض؟
I think I'm gonna figure out what happens next. This person died. He's gonna figure out what happens next.
I'm gonna figure out what happens next right now.
Oh, my grandma just came. I guess I'm gonna figure out what happens next.